The story leading up to the betrayal of Christ is slightly different in each of the four Gospels, each revealing certain details. And as we move towards the final fourth Gospel, we find even more details, and some aspects of this story are highly emphasized. The Gospel of Mark, probably the earliest one, does not mention many specifics, but it simply says that Judas went to the chief priests to betray Christ, and they promised to give him some money. The Gospel of Matthew is a bit more specific, as it says that the chief priests gave Judas 30 pieces of silver. And here we find that Judas was content to value the life of Jesus at the price of 30 silver coins. The Gospel of Luke tells us that Satan entered Judas. And immediately after this, Judas went to confer with chief priests and captains how he might betray Jesus to them. What is interesting here is that we have a medical doctor, Luke, who is diagnosing Judas with some sort of a supernatural condition. Mark and Matthew do not mention this, but Luke, a medical doctor, does. Sometimes we think that our thoughts, no matter how strange these may be, are after all only our thoughts. And since Freud, there has been a strong tendency to view these thoughts strictly as an expression of our own dark self or our own suppressed self, rather than something that may be coming from outside of us, perhaps from a non-physical or spiritual realm. But here we have Luke, a medical doctor, telling us that it was not simply nor strictly Judas and his own thoughts at play here, but somehow Satan and Judas united together to betray Christ. Now, this strange condition is not a demon possession. When we read about it in the Gospels, the people who were possessed would completely lose control over their physical and mental faculties. Not so with Judas. Somehow he was making this choice, but it was Satan also who was making this choice together with Judas and through Judas. In some strange manner, Judas and Satan were intimately related at this point. It is very difficult to distinguish who is doing what exactly, but both Judas and Satan were involved in this act. Some people suggest that the chief priests have also been intimately involved with Satan, and whether Satan darkened their minds so they did not recognize their Messiah, or all the evidence they witnessed pointed to Christ as their Messiah. And despite all this, they chose to ignore their conscience or the voice of God's Spirit. I don't know. Whether this was done consciously or in ignorance, it is not clear. But what is clear is that Judas betrayed Christ consciously. Whatever his motive was, it doesn't matter. He betrayed Christ consciously and willingly. And in his estimation, Judas was content to value Christ at the price of 30 pieces of silver. The Gospel of John gives us more details about this story than any other gospel. One of the reasons is that John was very close to Jesus in general. But also, John was, as we are told in his gospel, John was reclining right next to Christ during the Last Supper. He was right next to him. And he was the only one who could see that Christ gave the dipped piece of bread to Judas. Ultimately, the entire second half of John's gospel is dedicated to the last 7 days of Jesus' life on earth, or to the Passover week. And this second part of John's gospel begins like this. John chapter 12, from verse 1. Then, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. Then one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, "Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" There was a supper, and possibly out of gratitude for Jesus resurrecting her brother, Mary anointed the feet of Jesus with precious oil. Matthew and Mark simply mention that some were indignant at this, or that the disciples were grumbling about this, at the sight of this. These reactions do not seem to be critical for Mark and Matthew. But John reveals and emphasizes some very specific details here. Unlike Matthew, who simply mentions that the disciples were grumbling, John singles out one of the 12 disciples and says that Judas Iscariot was the one who complained about such great waste of material resources and appearing to be very charitable, attempting to do some charity work here. And very specifically, Judas pointed out that the fragrant oil could have been sold for 300 denarii. 300 denarii. If you read the parable of the workers in the vineyard, Jesus tells us that 1 day's wages amounted to 1 denarius. 1 denarius. So 300 denarii pretty much amounted to a full year's salary. What is a denarius? Denarii. Denarius was a Roman coin made out of silver. Roman coin made out of silver. And here we can go back to the beginning of this message, where it was mentioned that Judas was content to betray Christ for 30 silver coins. 30 silver coins. So Judas valued Jesus at 30 silver coins. And then he valued a bottle of perfume at 300 silver coins. Judas considered a bottle of perfume to be 10 times more valuable than Jesus, the person he walked with, and he talked with, and he lived with, and he shared his bread with. A bottle of precious, fragrant oil. valuable for sure, but to value it 10 times more than the life of his companion Jesus, 10 times more. Difficult to know what to make of this. And perhaps it is easy to look at this story from a distance. But when we come closer to home, there may be things in our lives that we value more than we value Jesus Christ, in terms of how much we are invested in certain things. So none of us should judge Judas. We should leave all judgment into God's hands. In the end, all of the disciples, all 12 of them, betrayed Jesus that night as they all abandoned him. They all abandoned him. But after that, they all came back to him. All but one. This story was written for a reason. And then it was highlighted and expanded even more in John's Gospel, so we can learn from it. As mentioned earlier, Luke, in his Gospel, pointed out on one occasion, only on one occasion in his Gospel, that Satan entered Judas. The Gospel of John adds to this by presenting it in a more gradual, progressive, and dynamic manner. The Gospel of John, chapter 13, verse 2, says, "And supper being ended, the devil, having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him," and so forth. So John reveals to us that there was a gradual development here, a dynamic movement in the person of Judas. At first, initially, the devil implanted a suggestion into the mind and heart of Judas. And these thoughts and feelings were brewing and fermenting and festering, boiling up. But Judas still had not consented. He still could have taken a different course of action. Despite his extreme thoughts and feelings, overwhelming thoughts and feelings, he could have still chosen to trust in Christ. Then further down in the same chapter 13 of John's Gospel, chapter 13, verses 26 and 27, Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it." And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now, after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Then Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." It was only at this point where Christ gave Judas a piece of bread that we are told that Satan entered Judas. In other words, here Judas consented willingly and consciously to do what Satan suggested earlier. What was going through Judas's mind while he was chewing that piece of bread? Was Judas remembering the words of Christ from before, when Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever eats my body, whoever eats me, will have life"? Somehow, it seems, at this moment, for whatever reason, Judas came to the point of despising Jesus so much that he could not and would not accept anything that Jesus had to offer. At that point, when Christ gave him a piece of bread, it was not just the bread, but it was the symbol of life, even life eternal. It was the symbol of Christ himself, that piece of bread. And Jesus knew that this was the final chance for Judas. It was the point of no return. If at this point Judas rejected what Jesus had been continually offering to him, Judas would be lost forever. And probably that is why after this, Jesus told him, whatever you are doing, go and do it quickly. Yes, it was all helped by Satan. But Judas was not demon possessed. He had a choice, and he made a choice. There are moments in this life, perhaps only a few moments, which existentialists describe in this manner. You feel like you're standing at a precipice, at the brink of life itself, and you're painfully aware that you have a choice. You have the choice either to step forward, to jump into the oblivion, or to turn around and walk away, walk the other way. And both the Christian existentialists and the atheist existentialists advise us to turn around and walk the other way, to choose life. And this existential crisis may come and show up in different forms and shapes. I can recall only a couple of clear moments of existential crisis in my life where I felt that eternity was quickly slipping away from my grasp, where I felt in my conscience a deep conviction that I was about to experience the loss of something immeasurably invaluable, something I could not explain nor understand, nor figure out how or why it came to me, into my mind and heart. I certainly did not invite it in, but it was there, right in front of me and in me, and it was not going away. Something, something unimaginably and inconceivably immense and vast. And I was deeply and unmistakably convinced that it was real. And I had to make a choice. In this fragile world and this fragile life, being surrounded with fragility and imbued with fragility, what do we place value on when everything is so fragile? And unless we find something above and beyond fragility, something higher and greater than what we see around us, to invest into, we will eventually lose everything we have and everything we are. So the question for you and me remains, what is it really and truly that you and I value most, more than anything else?